So then it seems to me that though Paul and James, on the surface of it, seem to contradict each other on faith and works, the visions that they present of faith in action are really much the same, certainly in harmony. Faith in God, trust in God, needs to find expression in the way we live, and in particular, the way we treat one another. Both James and Paul call for faith lived out in love. And Paul puts the accent on faith largely because he is opposing any requirement that Gentiles have the law of Moses imposed on them. James puts the accent on works, perhaps because some in his community are using Paul's slogan, faith, not works, in ways that are unhelpful. In any case, our New Testament includes both of these voices, both Paul and James. We hear both accents on faith and action, and we need to hear both. The next portion of the lecture now turns to 1 Peter. 1 Peter carries the name of Peter, Simon Peter, perhaps the most important of Jesus' first group of disciples. As with James, some scholars wonder whether Peter the fisherman could have written a letter with Greek of such high quality. Whether from Simon Peter himself or from another early Christian who identified himself with the tradition, teaching, and authority of Peter, this letter responds to the challenge of living faithfully as a Christian in the face of increasing hostility from others in the Roman Empire in the last part of the first century of the Common Era. This is the central concern of 1 Peter, to provide pastoral encouragement and instruction for Christians whose new religious commitment has come under intense pressure in pagan culture. The letter addresses exiles of the diaspora, chapter 1, verse 1, persons for whom the label Christian is increasingly problematic in Roman society and in pagan, polytheistic culture. Readers, therefore, who live in a liminal zone, a between place. Their true home is heaven. That is where their inheritance is, chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Meanwhile, their participation in their own social world within the Roman Empire is becoming more and more precarious. This letter encourages and counsels readers whose Christian identity has brought suffering. The primary aim of 1 Peter is to sustain commitment to Christian faith and life despite great hardship. 1 Peter lacks the elaborate apocalyptic visions of the book of Revelation, and also its extremely negative assessment of the Roman Empire. Features of that book we'll explore in the next lecture. But 1 Peter does share with Revelation an environment hostile to Christian commitment, a concern to promote perseverance in the face of hostility, perseverance in faith and faithfulness, and also a concern to foster Christian hope. The setting of 1 Peter is not official or systematic persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire, but sporadic, unofficial hostility to Christians. For example, ridicule and harassment. Christians were often viewed with suspicion and contempt. Their regular private gatherings, their tendency to avoid many of the public activities of the pagan culture, and their social profile. Many were persons of low social status. All of these invited suspicion and contempt. In this difficult context, the letter guides readers who are experiencing pressure and harassment, guides them toward faithful Christian conduct in a culture that is hostile to Christian faith. The goal is persevering faithfulness in a world defined by non-Christian values, beliefs, and practices. Every chapter of 1 Peter addresses the challenge of suffering. To illustrate the context and main concern of the letter, I'll point to chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. Listen. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Yet if any of you suffers as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name, the name Christian, Christ people. It was not easy to be out and public as a Christian in the world of 1 Peter. What pastoral wisdom does the author offer for readers who are suffering because of their Christian commitment? First, the author assures us that the experience of adversity is not forever. It's temporary. Suffering for one's faith now is only a step toward glory. Also, suffering because of one's faith commitment displays the genuineness of one's commitment. So, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Second, 1 Peter presents Jesus as our model for dealing with suffering. Chapter 2, 18 to 23, and chapter 3, 13 to 18. Though innocent, he, Jesus, suffers, but he does not retaliate. He trusts his vindication to a higher court, to God. Third, the author warns against suffering for the wrong reasons. If readers live well and do what is right, and for that reason suffer mistreatment from others, then all the shame and dishonor belong with the ones who would harm them. Christians are called to bear witness to their deepest convictions, gently but insistently, and trust their vindication to God. Chapter 3, verses 13 to 18, and chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. Finally, there is solidarity in suffering. Chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. The author writes, "For you know that your brothers and sisters in all the world are undergoing the same kinds of suffering. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. Again, we hear that the suffering of the present time is not forever. It is temporary. And it will give way to participation in the glory of God. Now, there's a potentially wounding way of reading 1 Peter on this theme of suffering. Does this letter ask us to embrace suffering and victimhood? It's important to read this theme wisely. 1 Peter does not teach us to seek out suffering. Instead, this is the message. We are called to speak and live the truth we know. Yet in a world like 1 Peter's, perhaps a world like ours, speaking truth, especially speaking truth to power, when the powers are unjust and oppressive, well, that's almost sure to bring trouble. So the appeal of 1 Peter is not to seek out suffering, but rather to seek to be faithful, even if our faithful witness and embodiment in practice of the truth we know brings trouble, brings resistance, brings suffering. I would suggest that this same point applies to the book of Revelation, as we'll discover in the next lecture. We're not called to seek out suffering, but we are challenged to bold witness, and that may bring suffering. We trust our honor and our vindication to God. One last observation about 1 Peter. This commitment to embody our faith authentically in our social context, in some circumstances, must mean vigorous advocacy on behalf of others who are victims of abuse. We're called sometimes to stand up with and to stand up for those who are victims of abuse and exploitation and injustice, against those who abuse or exploit them from a position of greater power. 1 Peter places us in the company of those who suffer, and from the perspective of heaven, gives us reason for hope and reason to extend meaningful hope to others, even when the going gets tough. So this completes my reflections on 1 Peter. The last section of Lecture 9 will turn to Hebrews.